If you've had a life insurance case that got derailed because your client used marijuana products, you're not alone. It actually happens quite often. However, there are things that you should know about to avoid those problems. Hi, I'm Dave Donchie with Leisure, Worden and Terry. Thanks for joining. And also joining me today is Victor Paz, my sales associate. And we're going to go over some of the finer points that you need to know about when it comes to marijuana use and your clients applying for life insurance to try to get the most successful outcome that they can get. So listen in. So Victor, there's no question marijuana use is widespread, it's very popular, and it does impact life insurance underwriting, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Right. And maybe not so much as like in the old days. In the old days, if your client was using marijuana and you try to get a life insurance offer, they were either a decline or they were most likely rated if they did get an offer, and almost always they were considered a smoker or they got a tobacco rate, right?
Well, you would say that the best case scenario for those individuals would always be a smoker policy.
Right, and those cases are tough to place because the premium jumps so significantly.
Absolutely.
If they're lucky enough to get an offer,
to even get an offer,
right,
absolutely.
Right. And today, I think what's important today when we talk about life insurance underwriting for marijuana users is that no two carriers are created equal. Carriers look at this differently, don't they?
Absolutely. You know, we represent a lot of carriers, and we still have carriers that look at marijuana use as a very unfavorable mortality risk. All the way to many progressive carriers that look at it as not an unfavorable activity. So I think it has to do with one thing. I think it has to do mainly with interpretation. Two schools of thought. One is there's the political and the legal issue, which we'll get into, but also I believe that, you know, there's studies that show that go back to the 80s that medical marijuana use or recreational marijuana use has really no impact on mortality.
I've asked underwriters this question quite often. I never have anybody come back and say, yes, it does increase mortality. Obviously, you have different types of use, different people that use it for different purposes, which we'll talk about. But the good news is that the underwriting is changing and it's loosening up, and you can get a good offer for somebody who uses a marijuana product.
You can get an extremely good offer with some of the more progressive carriers.
Right.
And like I said, it goes back to their interpretation of what medical marijuana does to you, number one, and also the political legal arena.
And you touched on it a minute ago. When it comes to use, there's recreational use and there's medicinal use. Those things factor into the underwriting process as well. We'll talk about that. And it's important. There is a distinction, and it does matter in terms of what an underwriter sees, right?
Right, and that goes back to obviously field underwriting.
Right.
And in determining and asking the right questions, whether it's medical, whether it's recreational, and you know we'll get into those areas later on.
Okay. So Victor, speaking of field underwriting, it's probably the most important thing that a producer can do to make sure their client gets a good offer. Let's talk about where marijuana use shows up, because it can show up from a variety of places. And perhaps the most important place that it should show up is when a producer asks their clients, right, when they sit down to fill out the application or they interview the client, they should be asking the client, tell me about other types of avocations. Do you use any drugs? Alcohol, drug history, marijuana use, whether you think it's a drug or not, you've got to ask your clients, do you use marijuana products or cannabis products?
And let's be sure, the use of marijuana is not like it was 15, 20 years ago. It's just not the same. Even though it's categorized as a drug, it's not the same thing. So the most important thing that a producer can do when they're interviewing their clients, and we always push for really good field underwriting, is to ask them the specific question. Do you use medical marijuana or recreational marijuana?
Right.
And they may get a surprised look on their face and say, yes, is that okay?
I think you're right, because clients think, well, if I don't mention it, it'll never come up, right?
Exactly.
And they think it's really an evil thing that they shouldn't disclose because it'll hurt their chances, when in reality, if you don't disclose it, it hurts your chances if it's found out. And if you do disclose it, there's a very good chance we can find the right carrier for that producer.
Well, we know what always happens when there's lack of candor.
Yes, it doesn't help things.
Right.
So you talk about full disclosure, which is very important. Carrier interviews. Carriers will interview clients, especially when a producer uses a drop ticket or an electronic application through IGO. Carrier is going to conduct a telephone interview, and they're going to ask the client, and if the client doesn't tell the producer and does tell the interviewer, that's probably a good thing. But if they don't tell either one, it still can show up later on.
It's still going to show up. In some situations, a client, an insured, will tell the insurance agent one thing, and then they don't tell the interviewer the same thing. So consistency is extremely important.
Very, very good point.
Consistency is really important.
Also, it'll show up in an exam, right? The life insurance requires an exam, and the examiner will go out and ask the client these questions that are found on the Part 2, and they're going to, the client has to, again, disclose this information.
Once again, that's the third layer. Now you've got a medical examiner showing up at your office or home, and they're going to ask the same question again. So consistency is extremely important.
Right, right. And medical records, right? There's another place it shows up. The carriers will order medical records, and if an applicant had told the physician, I use marijuana nightly to go to sleep, or I've used it in the past, it's going to show up. The underwriter's going to see it, right?
Everybody that has a physical exam on an annual basis always will get the questions about lifestyle. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, they're always going to get those questions. And once again, there's going to be medical records that may go back 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden an underwriter will pick up on that, but yet it wasn't mentioned on the medical exam.
Exactly. And the other places I think about where it could show up as well, and these are a little bit more obscure that people don't think about, is public database checks.
Right.
Some carriers do internal background checks, and as well the internet. The internet has a lot about what people do, doesn't it?
I'll comment on the internet first. The internet is a great place to get to know somebody, okay? That's all you need to say about that. With regards to, for example, RX checks, prescription, that is marijuana use, or whether even if you have a card for medical purposes, it's not going to show up in that database, okay? So once again, we go back to the field underwriting, we go back to the carrier interview if it's a phone call, and we go back to the medical exam, and then not to forget that what you've told your doctor in the past.
Right.
Okay.
Right, and that we talked about the internet. Be careful what you post on Facebook. Obviously, people post pictures and they post comments about what they do. Underwriters do pick that up, especially for high-profile people that are more public-oriented, and those things do show up, and they tend to come back and bite people because they didn't disclose it, and that's important.
It's something permanent about the internet, right?
That's right, yeah. All right, very good. So, Victor, obviously, when we talk about underwriting, every carrier underwriter wants to know what is the purpose of the insurance. What's their life insurance for? And when we talk about somebody who's using marijuana products, it's also very important because carriers have a distinction or make a distinction between life insurance for business insurance purposes versus for personal insurance purposes when we talk about the cannabis industry, right?
Correct, correct. So you're going to have insurance for personal reasons and business reasons. And right now, generally speaking, insurance carriers are not underwriting for business purposes when it has to do with the medical marijuana industry.
Right, a very important distinction. So if you, say, had somebody who was a grower or very involved in the business aspect of the marijuana industry, the cannabis industry, and they said, well, we need a $5 million key person policy, most carriers in general are not going to offer that due to the federal laws, correct?
That's correct. We have found situations where, for example, you may have somebody who distributes fertilizer, for example, to the medical marijuana industry, but also their business will distribute fertilizer for regular agricultural business. That could be okay if that individual is looking for business insurance. But if it's specific for the medical or the marijuana industry, then it's going to be very tough.
Or let's say you had somebody who is in the marijuana industry, or we could call that cannabis industry, and they needed personal insurance. Will carriers offer that?
Oh, for personal purposes, that's not a big deal at all. That's just go, for income replacement, estate liquidity, whatever those personal reasons are, that's not going to change. Right now, it has to do with business insurance, and really it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's about the federal law versus state law. And right now, the federal law usurps state laws.
Right, and a good point. And we expect that to change, but for right now, that's the way it sits.
I expect it to change. I mean, we've seen so many changes within the last 5 years, let alone. I think in the near future, that's going to change.
Right. Okay. Okay, Victor, let's talk again about what kind of offers the producer can expect for their client, for those that choose to use marijuana products. So we know it depends, right? We talked about earlier, it can be everything from a preferred non-smoker rate all the way down to a decline. So there's a really wide range, isn't there?
Absolutely. Even with the favorable carriers, the more progressive carriers, you can still get a decline, okay? Just because they're favorable and they're progressive doesn't mean that they're all going to be favorable offers. There could still be a decline. Of course, our job is to identify those on behalf of the producer so that we can put them with the most favorable carrier.
Which really speaks to the point, which is we need to learn about that prospect, that applicant, before the case ever goes in.
Before it ever leaves our door.
Right,
yeah.
So that we can have an understanding as to how often they're using and how they're using it and what they use it for, so we can place them with the most appropriate carrier, get them the best rate we can.
And that's a good point, Dave, because you know what they're using it for. Sometimes they're just using medical marijuana for a medical reason. They're going to underwrite also the underlying reason they're using medical marijuana.
Right.
And also for recreational purposes, they just may use it, for example, they want to just go to sleep and relax at night. So it depends on the use, the frequency of use, and whether it's medical or whether it's recreational. Very different distinctions.
Very, and every case is different. Underwriters look differently at, say, somebody in their early 20s who's using it versus someone in their 40s or 50s who's using it. Obviously, if you had a professional, somebody that was just trying to relax at night to go to sleep, that may be a more favorable picture than, say, if you had a 22-year-old who was smoking every day. Underwriters not going to like that, are they?
Absolutely. They're going to look at, you know, the overall picture.
Right.
They're going to look at occupation. They're going to look at what the purpose of the insurance. They're going to look at your age. They're going to look at many, many factors, because an underwriter looks at the whole picture as opposed to just one aspect of it.
And therefore, I'm going to underscore field underwriting, right? It all starts and ends with a producer asking the client the questions, getting them to disclose all of the facts, not letting these things show up later on, right? And getting all the information up front.
I think you mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, our video, that you mentioned something about how can a case get derailed. And field underwriting is so important. Make sure that you ask questions. Make sure that you tell your client, you know, just be candid about your drug use or whatever it is, alcohol use. In this case, it's marijuana use. But that is one of the things that can derail a case, where it can be avoided.
Right, sure can. All right, so let's summarize what the carrier underwriter needs to know and what the producer has to ask, right?
Absolutely.
So let's start out with this. What is the purpose of using marijuana? Because you can't just say, I use marijuana. It's not enough information, is it?
There's two reasons why you're using marijuana. One, you're using it for medical purposes, okay? And the other one is recreational. That's it.
Got to be either one.
It's got to be either one. So
Right.
just because your client says, I use marijuana, you have to dig a little deeper and ask them, well, let's distinguish between medical use and recreational use. Because if it's medical use, obviously there's an underlying reason for why you're using medical marijuana.
Right, good point. And also, they want to know, how often are you using it? Every day, a couple times a week, once a month, a couple times a year.
Right.
There's a distinction, isn't there?
So yes, in order of importance, we've distinguished now whether it's medical or recreational. And after that is, well, how often is it? Is it once a month? Is it once a year? Doubtful, but it's the frequency of use.
Right.
Daily, multiple times a day, that sort of thing.
And finally, there's the method, or let's call it the delivery system of how somebody is using it, right? Because you can smoke it. Yeah, there are vaping systems, there are edible systems.
Creams, I think.
I don't know that much about it, but this is what I hear.
I'm surprised that there are so many ways that you can ingest. Is it THC, right?
Right.
And you can ingest, and
the carrier underwriter wants to know.
Right. So going back to layers of importance, you want to know how you're doing. Is it an oil? Is it a marijuana joint? Different ways of ingesting marijuana. So they want to know how they're using it.
Right. Very important to disclose that information.
Right. Exactly.
Good. So let's finish up this session and talk a little bit about what the deal killers, the case killers are that can completely ruin an applicant's chances of getting a good offer. And I'd start by saying, again, going back to lack of candor. If they don't disclose it, it shows up later on, the carrier underwriter doesn't look at that favorably, do they?
No, how many times do we get a situation where an individual will answer a question one way, or whether it's a phone interview or whether it's on an application or a medical exam, and then the underwriter uncovers something that's completely opposite in the medical records, okay?
Right.
Or internet search, or a background check.
Right.
So consistency and full disclosure are so important, and that all takes place in the very beginning with field underwriting.
Field underwriting. You've heard us say that several times. The producer may need to get a little bit more assertive with the client, just letting them know we want to get all this stuff out up front. It may not hurt our chances of getting a good offer later on. Well, we definitely don't want to not disclose only for things to find out that are found out later on that hurt your chances of getting a good offer.
I completely agree. We understand the sensitivity of some of the questions that you may ask, but the good news is, with regards to marijuana use, the good news is that it's not the way it used to be.
Right.
It's not the way it was maybe 10, 15 years ago.
More acceptable.
Whether it's acceptable, people should be as sensitive about it, and there are situations that people aren't even aware that they can buy life insurance and still use marijuana on a recreational basis.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, good point. So Victor, in closing, there's no question that not all carriers are created equal when it comes to underwriting folks who choose to use marijuana products, right?
Absolutely. We represent a lot of carriers, okay? And it's amazing to me how vast the interpretations are. Some favorable to not so favorable. So it's so important for you, the producer, to give us a call so that we can help you along in that very early stages of a case. We call it field underwriting, so that we can make sure that we point you in the right direction. Every case is going to be a little different, okay? So the more information we have, the better. But it's extremely important that we get that out, taken care of in the very front end versus having to deal with it, halfway through the underwriting process.
That's a good point. Don't let your case get derailed for your clients that choose to use marijuana and cannabis products. Give LWT a call. We'll be glad to walk you through the case and let you know what you need to ask your clients. Thank you for watching. I'm Dave Donchie for Leisure, Worden and Terry.
Hey, come on, man.
Who is it?
It's Dave, man. Will you open up? I got the stuff with me.
Who?
Dave, man, open up.
Dave?
Yeah, Dave.
Dave's not here.
No, man, I am Dave, man. Will you, come on, open up the door, will you? I got the stuff with me. I think the cops saw me.
Who is it?
Oh, what the hell? Come, man, open up the door. It's Dave.